Night falls early in Willowmere, the kind of darkness that seems to press against the chapel's stained glass windows, eager to seep inside. On the evening of October 17th, 1892, the villagers gathered, as they always did, drawn by the promise of music, of comfort, of something sacred to hold back the encroaching gloom. The Willowmere Chapel, with its weathered stone and flickering candlelight, was a sanctuary from the world's uncertainties. But that night, as the choir assembled beneath the vaulted ceiling, something felt different. The air was heavy, thick, with the scent of rain-soaked earth and the faint, metallic temps of fear. Imagine yourself there, seated in a pew, the wood cold beneath your hands. The choir children and adults alike stood in their crisp white robes, faces illuminated by the golden glow of lanterns. Their voices rose in perfect harmony, weaving through the nave, each note a fragile thread holding the darkness at bay. Yet, beneath the beauty, there was a tremor, a subtle discord, a warning hidden in the melody. Did anyone else hear it? Would you have? Outside, the wind howled, rattling the chapel doors. Thunder rolled across the moors, and for a moment, the music seemed to falter, as if the storm itself was trying to drown it out. Some say the choir's final hymn was unlike any before, haunting, mournful, almost pleading. Others remember a sudden chill, a flicker of shadow at the edge of the candlelight, a sense that something was watching, waiting. When the last note faded, silence fell, a silence so deep it seemed to swallow the world. The congregation waited for the familiar shuffle of feet, the gentle laughter, the comfort of routine. But instead, there was only emptiness. The choir had vanished, no footprints in the mud, no echo of voices in the night. Only the memory of that final, unearthly song. Tonight, we return to Willowmere Chapel, to the night the music died. Over the next hour, we'll unravel the mystery of the vanished choir, a story that will challenge everything you think you know about faith, community, and the darkness that sometimes dwells within us all. Listen closely. Would you have heard the warning in their song? To understand the tragedy of Willowmere Chapel, we must first step into the world that birthed it, a world both familiar and foreign, where the line between the living and the lost was as thin as the morning mist. Willowmere, 1892. Nestled in the rolling green heart of the English countryside, the village seemed, at first glance, untouched by time or trouble. Thatched cottages clustered along winding lanes, their gardens bursting with wildflowers and the sweet scent of honeysuckle. Children played in the meadows, their laughter echoing across fields dotted with grazing sheep. The air was thick with the hum of bees and the distant toll of the chapel bell, marking the hours with a steady, comforting rhythm. At the village's center stood Willowmere Chapel, its stone walls weathered by centuries of wind and rain. The chapel was both a landmark and a lifeline, a place where births were blessed, marriages celebrated, and the dead mourned. Its spire rose above the rooftops, visible for miles, a silent sentinel watching over the village. Inside, sunlight filtered through stained glass, painting the pews with shifting patterns of ruby and sapphire. The scent of old wood and beeswax mingled with the faint, lingering aroma of incense. But beneath this pastoral calm, Willowmere was a place shaped by secrets and shadows. The villagers were bound together not just by blood and tradition, but by a web of whispered fears and unspoken rules. Superstition ran deep here, as much a part of daily life as the bread on the table or the water drawn from the well. Some said the land itself was haunted, that the moors beyond the village were home to things best left undisturbed. Others spoke of the Willowmere Veil, a thin, invisible boundary that separated the safe, sunlit world from the darkness lurking just beyond. It was a place where omens were heeded and warnings rarely ignored. A black cat crossing your path meant a day of misfortune, a sudden chill in the air, a flock of crows circling the chapel spire. A dream of water rising each was a sign, a message from forces unseen. The villagers clung to rituals and charms, sprigs of rosemary above doorways, iron nails driven into thresholds, prayers whispered at dusk. Even the most devout churchgoers hedged their faith with a healthy respect for the old ways. The chapel itself was not immune to suspicion. Its foundation stones were said to have been laid atop an ancient burial ground, a place where the earth never quite settled. Some elders remembered stories of a previous chapel, burned to the ground in a fire no one could explain. Others recalled the tale of the weeping window, a pane of glass that, on certain nights, seemed to drip with moisture, as if mourning something lost. The vicar, Reverend Ambrose, dismissed such talk as nonsense. But even he could not deny the occasional oddity: a hymn book found open to the wrong page, candles snuffed out by an unseen hand, the echo of footsteps in an empty nave. Yet, for all its shadows, Willowmere was a community defined by togetherness. The villagers looked out for one another, sharing harvests and hardships alike. The choir was the beating heart of this unity, a group of voices that brought comfort and joy, their music weaving a spell of hope over the congregation. Choir practice was a weekly ritual, drawing children and adults into the chapel's embrace, their laughter and songs spilling out into the night. Still, there were those who felt the weight of something unspoken. Mrs. Hargreaves, the baker's wife, claimed to have seen a pale figure standing by the chapel gate at midnight. Old Tom, the gravedigger, muttered about restless bones and refused to work after sundown. Even the children, usually fearless, dared each other to touch the chapel door after dark, giggling nervously as they recited rhymes meant to ward off evil. As autumn deepened, the village seemed to draw inward, the days growing shorter, the nights colder and more uncertain. The harvest moon hung low and red in the sky, casting long shadows across the fields. The air was thick with anticipation, as if the land itself was holding its breath. It was in this atmosphere, half light, half shadow, that the Willowmere choir prepared for their final performance. No one could have guessed that the music they made would be their last, or that the chapel's ancient stones would soon bear witness to a mystery that would haunt the village for generations. If you lived in Willowmere, would you have trusted the comfort of the chapel or listened to the warnings whispered on the wind? Let us know in the comments below. The story is only beginning, and the veil is about to lift. To understand the loss that would soon befall Willowmere, we must first know those who were lost, the voices that once filled the chapel with hope, longing, and the fragile beauty of human connection. The Willowmere choir was more than a collection of singers. It was the living soul of the village, a tapestry of lives woven together by music and memory. At its heart was Eleanor Finch, the choir mistress. In her early 30s, Eleanor was a woman of quiet strength and gentle authority. She had come to Willowmere from the city, seeking solace after a personal tragedy she never spoke of. Her voice, a clear and haunting soprano, could hush even the most restless child. To the villagers, Eleanor was both a mystery and a blessing. Her devotion to the choir unwavering, her kindness a balm to all who knew her. She saw potential in every voice, no matter how small or uncertain, and believed that music could heal wounds the world could not see. Beside her stood Reverend Ambrose, the vicar, whose deep baritone anchored the choir's harmonies. Stern but fair, Ambrose was a man of faith, but not without his doubts. He often lingered in the chapel long after services ended, lost in thought beneath the flickering candlelight. Some whispered that he carried a secret burden, a shadow from his past that sometimes crept into his sermons. Yet, when he sang, his voice was steady, a pillar of strength for the congregation. Among the children, none shone brighter than Lydia Hargreaves, the baker's daughter. Barely 12, Lydia possessed a voice so pure it seemed to float above the others, a silver thread weaving through the choir's tapestry. She dreamed of one day singing in the great cathedrals of London, her eyes alight with hope. Her best friend, Samuel Pritchard, was her opposite in every way, shy, awkward, and often overlooked. But when Samuel sang, his voice revealed a depth of feeling that surprised even himself. The two were inseparable, their laughter echoing through the chapel as they practiced scales and hymns. The adults brought their own stories and sorrows. Mrs. Edith Carraway, the widow who played the chapel organ, had lost her husband to the fever that swept through Willowmere years before. Music was her refuge, her way of speaking to the world when words failed. Thomas Bell, the blacksmith, sang Bessa, booming, joyful sound that belied the grief he carried for a son lost at sea. Agnes and Ruth Miller, twin sisters in their late teens, sang alto and soprano, their voices blending so seamlessly that villagers joked they shared a single soul. Each member of the choir brought something unique: a memory, a longing, a secret hope. Together, they created something greater than themselves, a harmony that seemed to lift the very stones of the chapel. For the villagers, the choir's music was a lifeline, a reminder that even in the darkest times, beauty could still be found. But beneath the surface, tensions simmered. Eleanor's arrival had upset old hierarchies. Some resented her influence, whispering that she brought city ways and strange ideas. Reverend Ambrose's sermons had grown more somber, hinting at a coming trial. Lydia's mother worried that her daughter's dreams would lead her away from Willowmere, while Samuel's father, a stern farmer, disapproved of his son's softness. Even the twins, Agnes and Ruth, had begun to drift apart, their once unbreakable bond strained by secrets neither dared to share. The chapel was both sanctuary and stage for these hidden dramas. Its walls had witnessed confessions and betrayals, laughter and tears. In the quiet moments before rehearsal, Eleanor would sometimes find Lydia gazing at the stained glass, lost in thought, or Samuel tracing patterns in the dust, his brow furrowed in concentration. Mrs. Carroway's hands would tremble on the organ keys, as if she played not just for the living, but for the dead. Yet, when the choir sang, all differences faded. Their voices rose together, filling the chapel with light. The villagers would gather outside, listening in silence, the music drifting through the open windows and out across the fields. For a few precious moments, Willowmere was united, old and young, rich and poor, believer and skeptical, bound by the power of song. No one could have known that these moments were numbered. In the days leading up to the choir's final performance, a sense of unease crept in. Eleanor found a hymn book torn, its pages marked with strange symbols. Lydia spoke of dreams in which she wandered the chapel alone, her voice echoing in the darkness. Samuel grew withdrawn, his eyes shadowed by fears he could not name. Even Reverend Ambrose seemed changed, his prayers more urgent, his gaze lingering on the chapel's ancient stones. The choir's last rehearsal was tinged with something unspoken, or tension that hummed beneath the music, a sense that the world was holding its breath as they sang their final hymn. The light through the stained glass seemed to flicker, casting strange patterns on the walls. Some would later say it was an omen, a warning missed by all but the most sensitive. If you had been there, would you have sensed the coming storm? Or would you, like the villagers, have been swept away by the beauty of the choir's song? Share your thoughts below. Whose story speaks to you most? In Willowmere, the line between the ordinary and the uncanny was always thin. But in the days before the choir's final performance, that line began to blur in ways no one could ignore. It started with small things, easy to dismiss. At first, on a gray morning, Eleanor Finch arrived early to the chapel, her footsteps echoing in the empty nave. She found her favorite hymn book lying open on the altar, its spine broken, pages torn, and marked with strange, looping symbols. At first, she thought it the work of mischievous children, but the marks were too deliberate, too precise. She ran her fingers over the ink, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. That same afternoon, Mrs. Carroway, the organist, lingered after rehearsal to practice alone. As her hands moved over the keys, she heard a voice, soft, almost pleading, singing a melody she did not recognize. The sound seemed to come from the shadows behind the altar, but when she turned, the chapel was empty. She told herself it was her imagination, a trick of the acoustics, but the memory lingered, unsettling and persistent. The children, too, began to whisper of strange happenings. Lydia Hargreaves confided in Samuel that she'd seen a figure standing in the graveyard at dusk, watching the chapel with hollow eyes. Samuel, ever the skeptic, laughed it off until he, too, heard footsteps following him home one night, crunching in the fallen leaves, just out of sight. He ran the last stretch to his cottage, heart pounding, and did not speak of it again. Rumors spread quickly in Willowmere, carried on the wind and woven into the fabric of daily life. Old Tom, the gravedigger, claimed to have found fresh earth, disturbed atop a grave that should have been settled for decades. He muttered about restless bones and refused to work after sundown, his lantern swinging wildly as he hurried home. Mrs. Hargreaves, Lydia's mother, awoke one night to the sound of singing drifting through her open window, a song she recognized as the choir's, but sung in a language she could not understand. Even the animals seemed uneasy. The village dogs howled at the chapel bell, and the horses shied away from the path that led past the graveyard. A flock of crows gathered on the chapel roof, their black wings beating against the sky, refusing to be driven off. The villagers exchanged uneasy glances, their conversations growing quieter, their laughter more forced. Reverend Ambrose tried to calm his flock, urging them to trust in faith and reason. But even he could not ignore the growing sense of dread. He found the chapel's candles snuffed out each morning, though he was certain he'd left them burning. He discovered muddy footprints leading from the crypt to the altar, though the crypt's heavy door was always locked. At night, he dreamed of water rising, flooding the chapel, carrying away the voices of the choir. The tension reached a breaking point when a parishioner, Mrs. Winthrop, delivered a cryptic warning after Sunday service. She was an old woman, half-blind and given to muttering, but her words chilled those who heard them. The veil is thinning, the voices are calling. Beware the song that ends in silence. She pressed a sprig of rosemary into Eleanor's hand, her fingers cold and trembling. For protection, she whispered, before shuffling away. Eleanor tried to dismiss the warning, but the sense of unease grew with each passing day. The choir's rehearsals became strained, the harmonies faltering as nerves frayed. Lydia's voice, once so clear, wavered with fear. Samuel grew silent, his eyes darting to the chapel's dark corners. Even the twins, Agnes and Ruth, argued over forgotten lyrics, their bond unraveling under the weight of something unseen. The night before the performance, a violent storm swept over Willowmere. Rain lashed the windows, and thunder shook the chapel's ancient stones. The villagers huddled in their cottages, listening to the wind howl through the trees. Some claimed to hear singing carried on the storm, a chorus of voices, rising and falling in a melody both beautiful and terrible. Others heard weeping, or laughter, or the tolling of a bell that no one had rung. Eleanor lay awake, clutching the rosemary beneath her pillow, her mind racing with fear and doubt. She thought of the broken hymn book, the strange symbols, the voices in the shadows. She wondered if she had brought something with her from the city, some curse, some darkness that now threatened to consume them all. As dawn broke, the storm subsided, leaving the village shrouded in mist. The chapel stood silent, its windows dark, its doors closed against the world. The choir gathered for their final rehearsal, their faces pale and drawn. No one spoke of the night before, but the fear was palpably living thing that pressed against their hearts. If you had been in Willowmere, would you have ignored the omens or heeded the warnings? Would you have dared to enter the chapel on the night of the storm, knowing what might be waiting in the shadows? Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if you heard the voices in the wind? October 17, 1892. The storm had left Willowmere sodden and shivering, the air thick with the scent of wet earth and wood smoke. As dusk bled into night, the villagers gathered, lanterns bobbing like fireflies along the muddy lanes. The chapel's bell tolled, its sound muffled by the lingering mist, calling the faithful to sanctuary. Inside, the choir assembled in the vestry, their white robes gleaming in the candlelight. Eleanor Finch moved among them, offering quiet words of encouragement, her own hands trembling as she adjusted Lydia's collar and smoothed Samuel's hair. The children huddled together, eyes wide, voices hushed. Even the adults seemed subdued, their usual banter replaced by anxious glances and nervous laughter. From the nave, the congregation's murmurs drifted in familiar faces, neighbors and friends, all seeking comfort in the ritual of song. Mrs. Carraway settled at the organ, her fingers poised above the keys, while Reverend Ambrose stood at the pulpit, his gaze lingering on the flickering shadows that danced along the chapel walls. 7:45 p.m. The first hymn began. The choir's voices rose, tentative at first, then swelling with confidence as the music filled the space. The congregation relaxed, soothed by the familiar melodies. For a moment, the chapel was a haven of warmth and light, the storm and its omens forgotten. But outside, the wind had not died. It pressed against the stained glass, rattling the panes, carrying with it a low, mournful sound, almost like singing, but not quite human. Old Tom, standing at the back, shivered and crossed himself, his eyes fixed on the chapel door. 8 p.m. As the choir launched into their second hymn, a sudden chill swept through the nave. The candles guttered, their flames bending as if in a silent breath. Lydia's voice faltered, her eyes darting to the window, where a shadow seemed to flicker just beyond the glass. Samuel squeezed her hand, his own voice barely above a whisper. In the pews, Mrs. Hargreaves clutched her husband's arm, her heart pounding. She thought she heard a second choir distant, echoing, singing a counter-melody that twisted the familiar hymn into something strange and sorrowful. She glanced at her neighbors, but no one else seemed to notice. 8:10 p.m. A sudden crash of thunder shook the chapel. The organ's notes wavered as Mrs. Carraway's hands slipped, her face pale. The congregation gasped, but Reverend Ambrose raised his hand, steadying them with a prayer. "Let us not be afraid," he intoned, though his own voice trembled. In the vestry, Agnes and Ruth Miller exchanged frightened glances. Ruth whispered, "Did you see that?" Agnes shook her head, but her eyes were wide with fear. A cold draft curled around their ankles, carrying the scent of damp earth and something older, something sour. 8:15 p.m., the final hymn began. Favorite, a song of hope and redemption. She led the choir, her voice clear and strong, willing the others to follow. The music soared, filling every corner of the chapel, pushing back the darkness. But as the last verse began, the temperature dropped, breath misted in the air. The candles flickered and died, plunging the chapel into darkness. The only light came from the stained glass, glowing faintly with the memory of day. From the back of the chapel, a low moan rose, a sound that was not quite human, not quite animal. The congregation froze, fear rooting them to their seats. The choir's voices wavered, then faltered, as if something unseen pressed against their throats. 8:18 p.m., a scream shattered the silence. Lydia's voice, high and terrified, echoed through the nave. The congregation surged to their feet, panic rising. Reverend Ambrose shouted for calm, but his words were lost in the chaos. The door slammed shut with a force that rattled the very stones. The windows darkened, the stained glass swallowing its own light. The organ let out a single, discordant note, then fell silent. 8:20 p.m. In the confusion, some villagers tried to reach the choir, but an invisible barrier seemed to hold them back. The air grew thick, heavy, suffocating. The choir stood frozen at the altar, their faces pale, eyes wide with terror. Eleanor reached for Lydia, but her hand passed through empty air. Samuel called out, his voice lost in the rising wind. Agnes and Ruth clung to each other, their voices joined in a desperate, wordless song. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the chapel's doors and windows. The crows took flight, their cries lost in the storm. 8:23 p.m. Suddenly, all was still. The wind died. The candles flared back to life, casting long, twisted shadows across the empty pews. The congregation stood in stunned silence. The choir was gone. No footprints marked the floor. No trace of the singers remained. No robes, no hymn books, no lingering warmth. Only the faintest echo of their final note hung in the air, trembling, like a spider's web in the aftermath of a storm. Mrs. Carraway sat at the organ, her hands frozen above the keys, tears streaming down her face. Reverend Ambrose knelt at the altar, his prayers broken and desperate. The villagers searched the chapel, calling out names, their voices growing hoarse with fear and disbelief. Outside, the mist thickened, swallowing the chapel in a shroud of silence. The bell tolled once, then fell quiet. 8:30 p.m. Word spread quickly through Willowmere. Lanterns bobbed along the lanes as villagers gathered, their faces pale, eyes wide with terror. Some wept, others raged, but all were united in a single, unanswerable question. How could an entire choir vanish without a trace? As midnight approached, the chapel stood empty, its doors swinging open to the night. The only sound was the wind, whispering through the graveyard, carrying with it the memory of a song that would never be sung again. Would you have stayed to search the shadows, or fled into the night? Could you have faced the silence that followed the music? Tell us below what you have done, standing in the heart of the storm. Dawn broke over Willowmere with a pale, uncertain light. The storm had passed, but the village was changed. Where once there had been the promise of music, there was now only silence, a silence so deep it seemed to press against the windows and seep beneath the doors. The news spread like wildfire. The choir was gone. Not a single member had returned home. Not a single voice answered the frantic calls that echoed through the misty lanes. The search began at first light. Villagers, still in their night, gathered in the chapel yard, faces drawn and eyes red from sleeplessness. Reverend Ambrose led the first group inside, his Bible clutched tight in trembling hands. He moved from pew to pew, calling out names, his voice growing hoarse with each unanswered plea. Mrs. Carroway, the organist, wandered the nave in a daze, her hands reaching for the keys that had fallen silent. Lydia's mother collapsed at the altar, sobbing, her cries joined by others as the reality of the loss set in. Outside, the search parties fanned out across the village and beyond. Lanterns bobbed through the graveyard, their light flickering over ancient stones. Men and women combed the fields, the woods, the banks of the swollen river. They called out for their loved ones, their voices growing more desperate with each passing hour. Some searched in silence, faces grim, while others shouted prayers or curses into the wind. As the day wore on, the mood in Willowmere began to shift. The first shock gave way to anger, suspicion, and fear. Theories spread like weeds, each more outlandish than the last. Some insisted the choir had been abducted by gypsies, by vagrants, by some unknown enemy lurking in the countryside. Others whispered of supernatural retribution, punishment for sins unconfessed, or rituals left undone. A few, their eyes wild with terror, spoke of the Willowmere Vale, claiming the choir had been taken by the spirits that haunted the land. The village quickly divided into camps. The faithful clung to Reverend Ambrose, gathering in the chapel to pray for the safe return of the missing. They lit candles, recited psalms, and begged for a miracle. The fearful, meanwhile, turned to old superstitions. They hung sprigs of rosemary and iron nails above their doors, scattered salt across thresholds, and warned their children not to stray after dark. The rationalists, few and far between, insisted on practical explanations. They searched for footprints, questioned strangers, and demanded the constable from the nearest town be summoned. The constable, a doorman named Inspector Hale, arrived by midday. He listened to the villagers' stories with a skeptical ear, taking notes in a battered ledger. He examined the chapel, the graveyard, the surrounding fields. He found no signs of struggle. No evidence of forced entry, no footprints save those of the searchers themselves. The only clue was the broken hymn book, its pages still marked with strange symbols. Hale dismissed it as the work of children, but the villagers were not so sure. As the hours passed, the psychological strain began to show. Old Tom, the gravedigger, refused to leave his cottage, muttering about restless bones and unquiet earth. Mrs. Hargreaves, Lydia's mother, wandered the village in a trance, clutching her daughter's shawl and whispering her name. The Miller twins' parents accused each other of negligence, their grief turning to rage. Even the steadfast Reverend Ambrose began to falter, his prayers growing more desperate, his sermons tinged with doubt. Rumors spread that the choir had been seen walk in the lanes at midnight, their faces pale, their eyes empty. Others claimed to hear singing in the woods, a melody that twisted and changed, never quite resolving. Some villagers swore they saw lights in the chapel after dark, flickering shapes that moved behind the stained glass. Fear took root, growing with each retelling, until the village was gripped by a collective hysteria. Inspector Hale tried to restore order, but his efforts were met with suspicion and hostility. The villagers resented his skepticism, his refusal to believe in the supernatural. They accused him of arrogance, of blindness to the truth. Hale, for his part, grew frustrated with their superstitions, their refusal to accept rational explanations. The divide between faith and fear, reason and belief, widened with each passing day. In the midst of this chaos, Eleanor Finch's diary was discovered, hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the vestry. Its pages were filled with music, prayers, and confessions. She wrote of her fears, her sense that something was watching the choir, waiting for the right moment to strike. She described the broken hymn book, the strange symbols, the voices in the night. Her final entry was a single line: "If we sing tonight, may God protect us from what listens in the dark." The diary became a focal point for speculation. Some saw it as proof of a curse, others as evidence of Eleanor's fragile state of mind. The faithful clung to her prayers, the fearful to her warnings, the rationalists to her doubts. The village was united only in its grief, its desperate need for answers. As night fell, the searchers returned, empty-handed and exhausted. The chapel stood silent, its doors locked, its windows dark. The villagers gathered in the square, their faces illuminated by the flicker of lanterns. Some wept, others prayed, a few simply stared into the darkness, lost in thought. What do you believe happened to the Willowmere Choir? Was it abduction, supernatural retribution, or something else entirely? Share your theories in the comments below. Your voice is part of this story now, and together, we may yet find the truth. But for Willowmere, the truth remained elusive. The village was left to grapple with its loss, its faith tested, its fears laid bare. The search had ended, but the mystery had only deepened. In the days that followed the choir's disappearance, Willowmere became a village under siege, not by an outside force, but by suspicion, grief, and the gnawing hunger for answers. The search had yielded nothing but fear. Now, the investigation began, and with it, the slow unraveling of the village's tightly woven fabric. Inspector Hale, the constable from the nearest town, took charge of the official inquiry. He was a man of method and skepticism, his uniform always immaculate, his eyes sharp and unyielding. To him, the supernatural was a crutch for the weak-minded, and he made no secret of his disdain for the villagers' whispered tales. He began with the facts. The choir had vanished from a locked chapel, with no sign of forced entry or struggle. The only clues were the broken hymn book, the strange symbols, and the diary of Eleanor Finch. Hale questioned everyone, beginning with Reverend Ambrose. The vicar, hollow-eyed and trembling, recounted the events of that night in painstaking detail. He spoke of the storm, the hymns, the sudden darkness, and the panic that followed. But when pressed for anything unusual, Ambrose hesitated. He admitted to hearing voices in the wind, to feeling a presence in the chapel, but quickly dismissed these as tricks of the mind. Hale noted the vicar's unease, his faltering faith, and wondered what secrets he might be hiding. Next, Hale turned to the villagers. He interviewed Mrs. Carraway, who described the phantom melody and the cold that crept through the chapel. Old Tom, the gravedigger, insisted the land was cursed, recounting tales of restless spirits and ancient wrongs. The Miller twins' parents accused each other of negligence, their grief spilling over into bitter recriminations. Lydia's mother, still clutching her daughter's shawl, could only weep. But it was the outsider who drew the most suspicion, Mr. Silas Gray, a reclusive scholar who had arrived in Willowmere just weeks before the disappearance. Gray rented a room above the tavern and spent his days poring over old maps and parish records. He claimed to be researching local folklore, but his presence unsettled the villagers. Some whispered that he had brought the curse with him, that his questions had stirred something best left undisturbed. Hale confronted Gray in his cluttered room, where books and papers lay scattered like fallen leaves. Gray was calm, almost amused by the constable's suspicions. He admitted to visiting the chapel late at night, drawn by its history and the rumors of the Willowmere Vale. He spoke of ley lines, ancient rituals, and the power of collective belief. Hale dismissed it all as nonsense, but Gray's knowledge of the chapel's past was undeniable. As the investigation deepened, old grudges and hidden motives came to light. The Miller twins, Agnes and Ruth, had quarreled bitterly in the days before the disappearance. over a secret neither would reveal. Samuel Pritchard's father, a stern and silent man, had forbidden his son from singing, fearing it would make him soft. Eleanor Finch's diary hinted at a shadow from her past, a tragedy in the city that had driven her to Willowmere, and perhaps followed her there. The chapel itself became a character in the investigation, its history as tangled as the ivy that crept up its walls. Gray revealed that the chapel had been built atop an ancient burial ground, its foundation stones rumored to be cursed. Decades earlier, a fire had destroyed the original structure, killing several villagers. Some said the land had never recovered, that the spirits of the dead still lingered, hungry for company. Hale, determined to find a rational explanation, ordered a thorough search of the chapel and its grounds. The crypt was opened, revealing nothing but dust and bones. The graveyard was combed for fresh earth, but no new graves were found. The hymn book was sent to the city for analysis, but the symbols remained undeciphered, neither Latin nor Greek, but something older, something that seemed to shift and change under scrutiny. As days turned to weeks, the village grew restless. The faithful clung to prayer, the fearful to superstition. Some accused the vicar of failing to protect his flock. Others blamed Gray, convinced he had awakened a sleeping evil. Hale found himself caught between world science and superstition, innocence and guilt. Each interview, each clue, seemed only to deepen the mystery. One night, a group of villagers, driven by fear and desperation, confronted Gray at the tavern. They demanded he leave Willowmere, accusing him of witchcraft and worse. Gray stood his ground, insisting he sought only knowledge, but the confrontation left the village more divided than ever. Meanwhile, Reverend Ambrose's sermons grew darker, his faith eroding under the weight of unanswered prayers. He confessed to Hale that he had seen shadows moving in the chapel, heard voices calling his name. He wondered aloud if the choir's disappearance was punishment for some forgotten sin, or a test of faith he was doomed to fail. The investigation reached a fever pitch when a new clue emerged, a scrap of fabric, caught on a nail in the vestry, stained with something dark. Hale sent it for analysis, but the results were inconclusive. The villagers saw it as proof of violence, a sign that the choir had met a terrible end. Gray argued it was a remnant of an old ritual, a symbol of sacrifice. Ambrose saw it as a tester, call to deeper faith, or a warning to abandon hope. Throughout it all, the contrast between science and superstition, innocence and guilt, played out in every corner of Willowmere. The rationalists demanded evidence, the faithful sought miracles, the fearful saw omens in every shadow. The village was a crucible, its people tested by forces they could not understand. If you were in Inspector Hale's shoes, would you trust reason, or listen to the warnings of the past? Would you blame the outsider, the vicar, or something older? Still, share your suspicions in the comments. Your insight may be the key to unlocking the truth. But as the investigation stalled, a new discovery would soon shatter everything the villagers thought they knew, forcing them to confront the darkness at the heart of Willowmere Chapel. The days in Willowmere grew shorter, the nights colder and more oppressive. The investigation had yielded only suspicion and sorrow, and the village seemed to teeter on the edge of despair. But then, as if summoned by the collective desperation of the people, the truth began to claw its way to the surface, dark, tangled, and more terrible than anyone could have imagined. It began with a dream. Reverend Ambrose, haunted by guilt and sleeplessness, awoke one night to the sound of distant singing, faint, mournful, echoing through the stone walls of the vicarage. He followed the sound, candle in hand, through the empty streets and into the chapel. The air was icy, thick with the scent of old incense and something metallic. The singing grew louder as he approached the altar, until it seemed to come from beneath his feet. The next morning, Ambrose confided in Inspector Hale, and reluctantly, Silas Gray. Together, they returned to the chapel, their footsteps echoing in the silence. Gray, ever the scholar, examined the floor near the altar and found a faint outline of trapdoor, nearly invisible beneath the worn carpet. The villagers had long forgotten the crypt below, sealed off after the fire decades before. With trembling hands, Ambrose produced the ancient key, its iron cold and heavy. The three men exchanged glances, each silently daring the others to turn back. But the need for answers was stronger than their fear. The key turned with a groan, and the trapdoor creaked open, releasing a gust of air so cold it seemed to burn. Would you have dared to open the door, knowing what might wait in the darkness below? They descended into the crypt, lanterns casting long, quivering shadows on the damp stone walls. The air was thick with the smell of earth and decay. Rows of crumbling coffins lined the walls, their lids askew, as if disturbed by unseen hands. At the far end of the chamber, a small alcove was hidden behind a tattered velvet curtain. Gray reached out, his hands shaking, and pulled the curtain aside. There, on a stone pedestal, lay a book bound in cracked leather, its pages yellowed with age. The cover was marked with the same strange symbols found in Eleanor's hymn book. Hale opened it, his breath catching as he read the first lines. A diary, written in Eleanor Finch's careful hand. The diary revealed a secret that had festered beneath Willowmere for generations. Eleanor wrote of her arrival in the village, her hope that music could heal old wounds. But she soon sensed a darkness in the Chipola presence that grew stronger with each rehearsal, feeding on the choir's voices. She described dreams of singing in a language she did not know, of shadows moving in the corners of her vision, of a cold hand pressing against her throat as she slept. The final entries were frantic, the handwriting jagged and desperate. Eleanor confessed that she had discovered the truth. The chapel was built on cursed ground, the site of an ancient ritual meant to bind a restless spirit. The original choir, she wrote, had vanished in the fire decades before, their voices sacrificed to keep the darkness at bay. Now, as the anniversary approached, the spirit had awakened, hungry for new voices. Eleanor's last words were a warning. If we sing tonight, we sing for our lives. The song is the key, the lock, and the door. May God forgive us. As the men read, a sudden chill swept through the crypt. The lanterns flickered, casting wild shadows on the walls. From above, the sound of singing drifted down soft at first, then rising in a terrible, beautiful crescendo. The voices were unmistakable. The missing choir, their song echoing through stone and earth. Ambrose fell to his knees, weeping, his faith shattered. Hale, ever the skeptic, tried to rationalize what he heard, but his hands shook so violently he nearly dropped. The lantern, gray, pale, and wide-eyed, whispered that the ritual was not finished, that the choir's voices were trapped, neither living nor dead, bound to the chapel for all eternity. Driven by a mix of terror and resolve, the three men hurried back to the nave. The singing grew louder, filling the chapel with a sound both glorious and horrifying. The stained glass windows glowed with an unnatural light, casting twisted, shifting patterns on the walls. The air vibrated with the force of the music, as if the very stones were singing. At the altar, the choir appeared pale, translucent, their eyes wide and unseeing. Lydia stood at the front, her mouth open in a silent scream. Eleanor's figure hovered behind her, arms outstretched, as if trying to shield the children from the darkness that pressed in around them. Ambrose reached out, his voice breaking as he called their names. For a moment, Lydia's eyes seemed to focus, her lips forming a single word, help. Then, with a final, shattering note, the choir vanished, leaving only silence and the echo of their song. The villagers, drawn by the commotion, crowded into the chapel. Some fell to their knees, praying. Others fled in terror. Hale, his skepticism finally broken, could only stare at the empty altar, his mind reeling. Gray tears streaming down his face whispered that the cycle would continue, that the chapel would always demand a choir, that the voices of Willowmere would never truly be free. Would you have dared to open the crypt, to read the diary, to face the truth that lay beneath the chapel's stones? Or would you have turned away, content to let the past remain buried? Tell us in the comments, what would you have done, standing in the heart of the darkness? The revelation shattered Willowmere. The truth was more than a mystery solved. It was a wound reopened, a curse revealed. The choir's secret was out, but the cost was more than the village could bear. In the weeks that followed the revelation, Willowmere became a village of shadows. The chapel, once the heart of the community, stood silent and shuttered, its bell untolled, its doors chained shut. The music that had once bound the villagers together was now a memory too painful to bear, melody that haunted their dreams and echoed in the empty streets. Grief settled over Willowmere like a heavy fog. Families mourned not just the loss of their loved ones, but the loss of certainty, of safety, of faith itself. Lydia's mother wandered the lanes at dusk, her eyes searching the mist for a glimpse of her daughter's white robe. The Miller twins' parents left flowers at the chapel steps, their hands trembling as they whispered the names of the daughters they would never see again. Mrs. Caraway, the organist, locked herself away, her music silenced, her heart broken. Reverend Ambrose, once a pillar of strength, was a changed man. His sermons, when he gave them at all, were filled with doubt and sorrow. He spoke of mysteries beyond understanding, of sins that could not be forgiven, of a God who sometimes turned his face away. The faithful dwindled, pews left empty as villagers sought comfort in old superstitions or simply turned inward, their trust in the divine shattered. Inspector Hale returned to the city, his report inconclusive, his skepticism forever shaken. He spoke little of Willowmere, but those who knew him said he was never quite the same, haunted by music only he could hear, by questions that had no answers. Silas Gray, the outsider, left the village soon after. Some said he was driven out by fear, others that he left of his own accord, burdened by the knowledge he had uncovered. His room above the tavern remained empty, save for a single page torn from Eleanor's diary, a warning, or perhaps a plea, left behind for those who would come after. The chapel itself became a place of dread. Children dared each other to touch its cold stone walls, to peer through the cracks in the boarded windows. On stormy nights, some claimed to hear singing drifting from within a choir of voices, beautiful and mournful, forever trapped between worlds. The villagers avoided the chapel, crossing themselves as they passed, whispering prayers to ward off the restless dead. The land around Willowmere changed. Crops failed, livestock sickened, and the river flooded its banks more often than before. Some said the village was cursed, that the earth itself mourned the loss of the choir. Others believed the spirits had finally claimed what was owed, and that peace would return in time. But peace was slow to come, and the scars ran deep. The survivors carried their grief in different ways. Some clung to the rituals of the past, lighting candles and leaving offerings at the chapel door. Others turned to silence, their pain too great for words. The bonds that had once united Willowmere were frayed, trust eroded by fear and suspicion. Neighbors who had sung together now crossed the street to avoid each other's gaze. Yet, in the quiet moments, there were signs of resilience. Lydia's mother began to teach the village children the old songs, her voice trembling but determined. The Miller twins' parents organized a memorial, planting a grove of willow trees by the river, a living tribute to those who had been lost. Mrs. Caraway, after months of silence, was heard playing a single, sorrowful hymn on her piano, the notes drifting through the night like a prayer. The story of the vanished choir became a legend, passed down in hushed tones, a warning and a lament. Newcomers to Willowmere were told to respect the chapel, to heed the omens, to remember the price of ignoring the darkness that sometimes dwells beneath the surface. How would your community survive such a loss? Would you cling to faith or turn away? Would you seek answers or accept the mystery? Share your thoughts below. Your voice is part of this story now, echoing through the stones of Willowmere. In the end, the village endured, changed but not destroyed. The echoes of the choir lingered, a reminder that some songs, once sung, can never be forgotten, that the past, no matter how deeply buried, will always find a way to be heard. As the years slipped by, the story of the Willowmere choir became more than a local tragedy. It became a mirror, reflecting the deepest fears and hopes of all who heard it. The vanished voices lingered not just in the stones of the chapel, but in the hearts of those left behind, raising questions that have no easy answers. What truly happened in Willowmere? Was it the work of something evil, an ancient curse, a restless spirit, or the darkness that sometimes festers in the human soul? Or was it the result of collective fear, a community so tightly bound by superstition and sorrow that reality itself seemed to bend beneath the weight of their belief? Perhaps it was both, or neither, an intersection of faith and fear, innocence and guilt, the known and the unknowable. The story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths. How do we respond when the world no longer makes sense? Do we cling to faith, even as it falters? Do we seek rational explanations, or do we surrender to the shadows? In Willowmere, faith was both a shield and a prison, offering comfort, but also blinding the villagers to the dangers lurking in their midst. Fear, too, was a double-edged sword, uniting the community in their search, but also turning neighbor against neighbor, sowing suspicion and despair. And what of evil? Is it an outside force, waiting to be unleashed, or does it grow from within, nurtured by secrets, regrets, and the things we refuse to face? The Vanished Choir reminds us that sometimes the greatest horrors are not the ones that come from without, but those that rise from the depths of our own hearts. Was it madness, malice, or something beyond? Was the choir's fate sealed by ancient curses, or by the choices of the living? If you had been in Willowmere, would you have dared to seek the truth, or would you have turned away? These are questions without easy answers, and perhaps that is the true legacy of the Willowmere Choir. Their story endures not because it was solved, but because it was not, because it invites us to look inward, to question the boundaries of belief and doubt, to wonder what we might do when faced with the unexplainable. We invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever experienced something you couldn't explain? Do you believe in curses, in the power of collective fear, or in the resilience of faith? What would you have done, standing in the shadow of Willowmere Chapel, as the last note faded into silence? Your stories, your questions, your reflections, they are the living echoes of the Vanished Choir. Together, we keep their memory alive, and perhaps, in doing so, we find a measure of understanding in the darkness. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the shadows of Willowmere, place where music once brought hope, and silence now holds secrets. If you've made it this far, you're part of a rare community. Those willing to look into the darkness and ask the questions others fear to voice. If this story resonated with you, please consider subscribing and turning on notifications. Here, we explore the forgotten, the forbidden, and the unexplained stories that linger long after the last word is spoken. Your support helps keep these tales alive, and your voice in the comments shapes the mysteries we uncover next. What do you believe happened to the Willowmere Choir? Was it a curse, a crime, or something that defies all explanation? Share your theories, your own experiences with the unexplainable, or simply your thoughts on the nature of fear and faith. I read every comment, and your insights often lead to new investigations and deeper questions. If you're hungry for more, don't miss our next episode, where we'll journey into another shadowed corner of history, a place where the line between reality and nightmare is even thinner. Trust me, you won't want to miss it. And remember, some mysteries are never truly solved. Some songs are never truly finished. In Willowmere, the story lingers. Some say, on stormy nights, the choir's song still echoes through the chapel, ruined, soft, mournful, and waiting for someone brave enough to listen. Will you listen? If you're brave enough, let us know in the comments below. And if you have your own story, a family legend, a haunting, a question that keeps you up at night, share it. You never know when your voice might become part of the next mystery we explore together. Until then, keep your lanterns lit, your minds open, and your hearts brave. The darkness is never as empty as it seems.